This video is a continuation of the dependent samples t-test, and it's the interpretation. So I have the output here, and I'm going to go through it using Google Doc. So what I did is I pulled my file from Word over into my PSYCH 14014 folder that you should have, and I would recommend that you do the same. It looks a little bit weird in Word format or in Google Doc format, and it just kind of, it's just going to depend on what your system looks like. Like this looks different than a different one did 5 minutes ago. So Porto does what a Porto does and just roll with it. So this is our, this is actually our output here. So what I want to do is I first want to clean this up. You're always going to get this notes, and it tells you about the output and tells you about the analyses that were done here. We don't need this, so you can right click on it and you can delete the table if you want to. I'm going to save this as a docx. I'll just save it as a Google Doc. That's why it looks different. So let's try this again. There we go. So I will right click here and I'm going to delete my column or delete my table. So now that looks a little bit cleaner. You could also delete this information. This is just the file name, so it's not important. We do have a dependent samples t-test, so you could add a note to yourself if that's what you have. But we have some information here. We have paired sample statistics. We have paired sample correlations. We have the paired samples test, and then we have effect sizes. So one thing to note here is that this right here is actually the second line of this table, or the second part of this table. So this should be up here, and I'll show you what that looks like. So here it's right next to each other, but we just don't have that much width, okay? So what we want to do is want to go through this and understand what's happening here. First, we can see that the stress score after yoga, we have some information here. So this is everyone. They took yoga and then they were measured on stress. And so that's what this number represents. So we have an average of 26.33 for stress after yoga. And that was all 100 of the participants. And then we also have our stress score after Pilates. So the first thing we can do is we can look at those numbers and remember that our alternative hypothesis, I'm going to use H1, but it can also be HA for your alternative hypothesis. So remember that our alternative hypothesis was that Pilates would decrease stress more than yoga. And so we would expect Pilates will have lower stress scores. So that's what we're trying to find support for. So we would reject our null hypothesis or fail to reject, and that would give us support or not for this. What we can do right now, and yoga, let me finish my thought here. What you can do right now is you can look at this and say, well, Pilates has a slightly higher stress score. So descriptively, put this on a new line, what we can say is that Pilates has a higher mean, higher stress score than yoga. So this is a good example of getting a result in the opposite direction because we were doing a one-tailed test. And so because this is a one-tailed test and we were looking specifically for this, there's no way we can possibly find support for our hypothesis now. We're going to continue with it because we ran the information, but this is the wrong direction. So this is not what we thought we would find. So the way that you would write about this in APA, after you identify the level of the variable, you can put mean equals. So our mean for the Pilates condition was 26.88. And then our standard deviation, I'm going to round up. So it would be, so after Pilates 26.88, so it's going to be 13.04. And then I would make these italicized. Has a higher stress score than yoga. And then I would include the yoga stress score. Pilates stress score is I'll simplify my language, is higher than yoga. There we go. So then I would put my mean of stress score, which would be 26.33, and my standard deviation, which equals 12.29. So they're very similar. And remember, I just generated this data. It's fake data, so it makes sense that there's not really anything there to find. But what we want to do is we want to first look at this conceptually and understand that the difference is very small, first of all. So there's a very, very small difference, but it's in the wrong direction. So now we're not going to use this. We are not going to use this paired samples correlation. So I'm just going to gray this out, and I'm going to say no use for the paired samples correlations for this example, and you won't use this for this class. So we're not going to use it. I'm not going to delete it though, so that you know what to do with it. This is now the actual t-test result here. And again, it's split up onto two sets of responses here, but it should be the same. So this should be on the same line. So this gives you, notice that the pair is here. So you could have more than one pair, but we just have one. This is looking at the difference between yoga and Pilates. So this is our difference between yoga and Pilates. So the mean difference is 0.55. We have additional information about paired differences. We have a confidence interval, which we'll talk about in lecture, and I'll add a note about here. But what we really care about, what we really want to know is, one, we want to know our t-score. So we're going to get our t-score. We want our degrees of freedom. And we want our one-tailed significance. Now, for this one, you don't need a p-value, honestly, because it's the wrong direction. We can't possibly find support for our hypothesis. So this significance, we could just take this all together and say, well, this is greater than 0.05. This is not significant, and it's in the wrong direction, right? But this is the additional information that we would want here. So this is the other place that we would look. This effect sizes we'll talk about in just a minute here. But first, I want to address this. So the way that you would identify this is, again, you want to write out your t-score. So we have a negative, and it's going to be 0.31 because I'm rounding up from the 5, so it'd be 0.31, and then there's a leading 0 here because t-scores can be greater than 1. So that's a rule in APA and in scientific writing. We also have our degrees of freedom, which is equal to the sample size, which is 100. Do n, so our sample size is 100 minus 1 because we have one independent group here. So our degrees of freedom equals 99, but we can just get that right there. And then we have our significance. So we can just say p greater than 0.05, or you could report the actual number, but it's fine to put p is greater than 0.05. And what we're going to look for here is we're going to look at effect size. So in this case, we're going to talk about the Cohen's d. Hedges correction is for when you have less than 20 responses. We don't need to do that. You all should have 20, you should all have at least 20 responses, even after you cleaned up responses that might need to be removed. So here we're looking for this line, Cohen's d. And we are looking for the point estimate on that line, which is right here. So this is our Cohen's d, this point, negative 0.031. I just realized this is kind of small. But this is the negative 0.0103 for Cohen's d. So we have a very small Cohen's d. I would put a note here. So I'm going to say Cohen's d equals 0.03. So we use the leading 0 because it can be greater than 1. And I'm going to italicize the D. And you don't use the negative. It's just it's a measure of size. And so you can just use the absolute value. So Cohen's D is 0.03. And I'm going to put a note that this is very small. This is less than the small cutoff point. So you can put very small, almost zero. But again, it's in the wrong direction. So it's still not support for your hypothesis, no matter what. So in this example, you would fail to reject the null hypothesis because, going back up to the top here, if our alternative hypothesis is that Pilates will have lower stress scores than yoga, our null hypothesis, or H sub 0, is that, and I'll just copy this, is that Pilates will not have lower stress scores than yoga. And based on our findings, too much. All right, I'll deal with that later. Based on our findings, we don't have evidence to support this, right? So we're going to fail to reject our null hypothesis. We don't have evidence to say that, oh man, my computer's having a moment. There we go. We do not have evidence to support our alternative hypothesis. And so because our p-value is higher than alpha and it's in the opposite direction, it's the wrong direction of what we expected, we cannot reject this null hypothesis. So again, you'll describe it, you'll talk about the means, the standard deviations. You will need to include the t-score, the degrees of freedom, and your p-values. And then we're going to talk about how you write this out in APA style in lecture.